They say no one is born a star. They are forged, polished, invented. But in the shadowed dream factories of Hollywood, one creation surpassed them all. She was not forged. She was engineered, a breathing, intoxicating masterpiece of male ambition. Her name was Marilyn Monroe. But the world never knew the chilling truth. They never saw the blueprints. They never met the architects, the men who took a frightened orphan named Norma Jeane and meticulously built a goddess, only to discover that a living goddess is a dangerous thing to own. This is not the story of a movie star. This is the story of a psychological heist, the systematic dismantling of a human soul to erect an immortal icon in its place. Because to create Marilyn Monroe, they first had to kill the girl she used to be. The problem was, she refused to stay dead. Times ACT1. The blueprint for a bombshell times * Hollywood, 1946. A city built on illusion, powered by desire. In the executive suites of 20th Century Fox, men in smoke-filled rooms didn't discover talent. They manufactured it. They were gods of a celluloid Olympus, and they were looking for a new Aphrodite. They found her in the shy, stammering form of a brunette factory worker with a heartbreaking smile. Her name was Norma Jeane Doherty. She was raw material, a beautiful, empty canvas on which they could paint their most profitable fantasy. The first architect was Ben Lyon, a casting director with an eye for potential and a surgeon's lack of sentiment. He saw past the girl. He saw a product. He looked at Norma Jeane and decreed, "It's Jean Harlow all over again." The name was the first piece of her to be stripped away. Norma Jeane sounded too plain, too common, too real. Lyon suggested Marilyn, after a Broadway star he once knew. She, clinging to a fragment of her fractured family, offered her mother's maiden name, Monroe. And so, it was done. Marilyn Monroe. The name sounded like champagne and secrets. It was a spell, a declaration of intent. Norma Jeane was now a ghost, a before picture in her own life story. Then came the physical alchemy. The studio doctors and dentists descended like sculptors. Her hairline was raised with painful electrolysis to heighten her forehead. Her teeth were straightened, her nose subtly refined. They taught her a new walk, a new talk, a new, breathy laugh that would become the most famous sound in the world. She was a collection of meticulously curated parts, assembled and polished to catch the light in just the right way. She was stunning. She was perfect. She was a lie, and the lie was intoxicating, not just to the world, but to Marilyn herself. She began to speak of Marilyn in the third person, as if she were a separate entity, a dazzling stranger she inhabited for the cameras. "I often stood outside myself, watching this Marilyn," she would later confess. The architects had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. They had created a flawless illusion. But they made a critical miscalculation. They believed the woman they were erasing was weak, forgettable. They never imagined she would fight back from within the gilded prison they had built. A rehook was coming. A man who wouldn't just refine the blueprint, but would try to own the soul of his creation. The mask of Marilyn was beginning to fuse with her skin, the persona consuming the person. It was a suffocating, terrifying process. But before she could even understand the bargain she had made, a new architect arrived. A man who promised her the world, but demanded her entire being as payment. He was small, aging, and utterly obsessed. And he would be the one to light the fuse on her career and her life. Thanks times ACT2. The Svengali of stardom *. His name was Johnny Hyde, a titan, a kingmaker, one of the most powerful agents at the monolithic William Morris Agency. He was a frail man with a failing heart, but his eyes burned with a terrifying ambition. When he saw Marilyn Monroe at a party in 1949, he didn't see a starlet. He saw his last and greatest masterpiece. Hyde became the new and most formidable architect of her life. His control was absolute, his devotion pathological. He left his wife and family, dedicating every waking and dying moment to the cultivation of Marilyn. He became her shadow, her puppet master, her Svengali. He worked with a desperate urgency, as if racing against the clock of his own mortality. He forced her into acting classes, elocution lessons, history seminars. He believed she possessed an intelligence and depth the studios were too blind to see. Yet he also reinforced the very image that trapped her. It was a dizzying contradiction. He wanted to perfect the bombshell, but also legitimize the artist. The physical alterations continued under his obsessive direction. Whispers of more cosmetic surgery, a cartilage implant in her jaw, a subtle refinement of her nose, were a testament to his relentless pursuit of an impossible ideal. He was not enhancing Norma Jeane. He was perfecting Marilyn, his living sculpture. Their relationship was a chilling transaction of power and dependency. He gave her access, protection, and a belief in her own talent that she desperately craved. In return, she gave him her youth, her beauty, a reason to fight against the darkness closing in on him. He proposed marriage relentlessly. She, haunted by a past of abandonment, gently refused, unable to love the man who was both her savior and her jailer. "He was the only man I ever knew," she said, "who wasn't after my body. But he was after something far more valuable, her entire existence. He wanted to be the sole creator credited with the masterpiece." Hyde's influence was undeniable. He bullied and begged director John Huston for her role in The Asphalt Jungle. He lobbied with his last ounces of strength for her part in the classic All About Eve. These were small roles, but she stole every scene she was in. The world was beginning to see what Hyde saw. The product was ready, but as her star began its meteoric ascent, Hyde's was fading. His heart was giving out. In December 1950, just as he had secured her a 7-year contract with 20th Century Fox, the very validation he had bled for, Johnny Hyde collapsed and died. He died before he could see her truly conquer the world. He left her a star, but he also left her terrifyingly alone, adrift in a sea of sharks he had taught her how to swim with. His final act was a chilling warning, a prophecy whispered to his protégé. He told her she was now a property, a commodity, and that the men who came next would not be content to simply build her. They would want to own her. And the first in line was an American god, a hero who saw her not as a work of art, but as the ultimate prize. She stood at the funeral, a veiled figure of grief, completely alone. Hyde had been the architect, the mentor, the gatekeeper. Now the gates were wide open, and through them walked a man who represented everything America was supposed to be: powerful, proud, and possessive. A man who loved the goddess, but would come to despise the woman. Act 3. The Catcher in the Lie, Joe DiMaggio, was more than a baseball player. He was an icon of stoic, masculine American grace. The Yankee Clipper. He was quiet, dignified, and accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. And in 1952, what he wanted was Marilyn Monroe. He pursued her with a single-minded intensity. To a world hungry for fairy tales, it was the perfect match. America's greatest hero and its ultimate love goddess. Their marriage in 1954 was a national event, a coronation. But the public fairy tale concealed a private nightmare. DiMaggio was not an architect of her career. He was a warden of her life. He despised Hollywood, hated the men who stared at his wife, and loathed the persona she was forced to inhabit. He had fallen in love with the image on the screen, but he could not live with the machinery that created it. This was a new kind of cage. It wasn't built of studio contracts, but of patriarchal expectation. He wanted a wife, not a star. He wanted Norma Jeane, the quiet homebody he imagined existed beneath the platinum facade. But Norma Jeane was a ghost, and Marilyn was a global phenomenon. His jealousy was a poison that seeped into every corner of their lives. It was quiet, simmering, and then explosive. Stories of his controlling nature began to leak from their inner circle. He dictated what she wore, who she saw, the roles she could accept. He wanted to tear down the very thing he had coveted. The breaking point was inevitable, and it would become one of the most famous moments in cinema history. Lexington Avenue, New York City, the set of The 7-Year Itch. The scene was simple. Marilyn stands over a subway grate, and a rush of air sends her white dress billowing into an ecstatic, iconic image of feminine joy. For the world, it was magic. For Joe DiMaggio, watching from the shadows of the crowd, it was the ultimate betrayal. He saw not art, but a cheap spectacle. He saw hundreds of men feasting their eyes on his wife. His face, captured by a photographer in that moment, was a portrait of silent, volcanic rage. The fight back at their hotel was rumored to be brutal. The next day, the film's makeup artist would have to artfully conceal the bruises on her body. The image of the goddess was preserved, but the woman was battered. The paradox was complete. The moment that immortalized her as a symbol of freedom and desire was the very act that shattered her marriage. She filed for divorce just 274 days after their wedding. At the press conference, she could barely speak through her tears. She cited mental cruelty. The American fairy tale was over. DiMaggio had tried to capture a butterfly and pin it to a board. He wanted to own the goddess, and in the process, he had tried to crush the woman. He would love her for the rest of his life, sending roses to her grave every week. A tragic, decades-long apology for a love so possessive it could only end in destruction. But Marilyn was running from the bombshell caricature, running from the suffocating grip of men like Joe. She fled to New York, to the actor's studio, desperate to be seen as a serious artist. And there, she ran directly into the arms of an even more sophisticated architect, a man who wouldn't cage her body, but would instead lay siege to her mind. He was America's greatest living playwright. He saw her vulnerability, her intelligence, her pain, and he decided he would be the one to finally translate it into art. But he would do so by mining her soul for material, crafting a cage made not of jealousy, but of intellect. Times ACT4. The intellectual's cage asterisk. Arthur Miller was the antithesis of Joe DiMaggio, a celebrated public intellectual, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of Death of a Salesman. He was the conscience of the American theater. To Marilyn, he represented everything she yearned for: validation, artistic credibility, a mind that might finally see past the platinum hair and into her soul. Their union in 1956 shocked the world. It was the egghead and the hourglass, as the cynical press dubbed it. For a time, it seemed Marilyn had finally found her safe harbor. She retreated with Miller to a quiet life in Connecticut, embracing the role of housewife, poring over classic literature, and trying to leave Marilyn behind in Hollywood. Miller was initially captivated. He saw the frightened, intelligent child beneath the global superstar. She was a poet on a street corner trying to recite to a crowd that is gathered to tear her clothes off, he wrote. He saw her trauma, her brilliance. He saw a muse. And that is where the new architecture of control began. Slowly, the intellectual sanctuary began to feel like an intellectual prison. Miller, the great champion of the common man, grew to resent the blinding supernova of his wife's fame. He was eclipsed by the very thing he sought to understand. His frustration manifested in his work and in his private journals. The most devastating blow came when Marilyn discovered one of his open notebooks. In it, he confessed his disappointment in her, his fears that she was an anchor dragging him down, his shame at being Mr. Monroe. He had seen the broken girl inside her, and rather than healing her, he was dissecting her for his own intellectual torment. The ultimate act of psychological cruelty was yet to come. He wrote a screenplay for her, a final film they would make together. It was called The Misfits. It was his masterpiece, and it was her death sentence. The character of Rosalind Tabor was not just inspired by Marilyn. It pimes Marilyn. Miller poured every ounce of her vulnerability, her desperation, her childlike innocence, and her self-destructive tendencies onto the page. He weaponized his intimate knowledge of her psyche, forcing her to perform her own emotional autopsy for the entire world to see. "He could have written me anything," she later lamented. "And he writes me this. If that's what he thinks of me, well then I'm not for him and he's not for me." The production was a living hell, a public unraveling. Her marriage was disintegrating on set, in the harsh Nevada desert, under the unforgiving eye of the camera. She was trapped. The intellectual she had worshipped had become her most brutal critic, using his art as a scalpel. He had promised to see her soul, and he did. He saw it, documented it, and sold it as a tragedy for the screen. Their divorce was finalized before the film was even released. She had escaped the intellectual's cage, but she was more broken than ever. She had sought refuge in art, only to be turned into a tragic specimen. A rehook was on the horizon. A new phase of her life that would be even more dangerous. As her marriage to the great American playwright crumbled, the most powerful men in the entire world were taking notice. She was about to trade the world of art for the world of absolute power. She was entering a gilded cage far more perilous than any she had known before: Camelot. The men who came next wouldn't just control her career or her mind. They would control her reality. ACT5. The President's Prize, asterisk, the early 1960s. America was enthralled by a new royal family, the Kennedys. Camelot was a dazzling mirage of youth, intelligence, and power, and at its center was President John F. Kennedy. He was the most powerful man in the world, and he had an insatiable appetite for its most beautiful women. Marilyn Monroe, newly single and psychologically fragile, was drawn into their orbit. Her involvement with JFK, and later, his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, was not a simple affair. It was a descent into a labyrinth of political power, secrets, and surveillance. For the Kennedys, she was the ultimate conquest, a glittering prize to be enjoyed and then discarded. This was the most dangerous game she had ever played. These were not studio heads or jealous husbands. These were men who commanded armies and intelligence agencies. The architects of her image were now the architects of national security, and she was a beautiful, volatile liability. The glamour of the White House and the Hollywood parties masked a dark, transactional reality. Marilyn, who had always craved the love of a powerful father figure, naively believed her connection with the president was genuine. She confided in him, sharing her deepest insecurities and, more dangerously, her opinions on the political landscape she was now privy to. She began to feel watched, followed. Her phone made strange clicking sounds. Her friend, the singer Pat Newcomb, would later speak of a pervasive paranoia that gripped them both. It wasn't paranoia. It was the chilling reality of being entangled with the most powerful and ruthless political dynasty in American history. She was a pawn in their games, a distraction, a trophy. But as their involvement deepened, the Kennedys made the same mistake all the other men in her life had made. They underestimated her. They thought the dumb blonde was just that. They never imagined she would demand to be taken seriously. The relationship with JFK cooled, and he allegedly passed her along to his brother, Bobby. It was a callous and humiliating transfer of property. But her involvement with Bobby, the fierce and righteous Attorney General, may have been even more intense and perilous. Then came May 19th, 1962, Madison Square Garden, a birthday gala for the president. Marilyn was scheduled to sing. She arrived late, sewn into a scandalously sheer, flesh-colored dress glittering with thousands of rhinestones. When she took the stage, she shed her white ermine fur to reveal the dress, causing a collective gasp from the arena. Her performance of "Happy Birthday, Mr. President" was not the innocent tribute it appeared to be. It was a shockingly intimate, breathy, and seductive declaration. It was Marilyn, in front of the entire world, laying claim to the president. It was a public performance of a private affair, and it was an act of rebellion. For the Kennedy clan, it was a catastrophe, a reckless, public spectacle that threatened to expose the carefully constructed facade of Camelot. She had become more than a liability. She had become a threat. She knew their secrets. She kept a little red diary, she told friends, where she wrote everything down. The architects of power do not tolerate threats. The phone calls from the White House ceased. She was cut off, iced out, erased from the narrative as quickly as she had been written into it. But Marilyn would not be silenced so easily. She began making desperate, frantic calls to the White House and the Justice Department, calls that were never returned. She had been built up by Hollywood, possessed by a hero, analyzed by an intellectual, and was now being silenced by the most powerful men on earth. Every architect in her life had demanded a piece of her, and now, the most dangerous of them all, wanted to ensure those pieces could never be reassembled to tell their story. As the Kennedys retreated into the shadows, another old enemy saw their chance to strike. Times ACT 6. The studio's final betrayal times asterisk. While Marilyn was entangled in the lethal politics of Washington, her first architects were watching from Hollywood with cold, calculating eyes. The executives at 20th Century Fox, the men who had first bleached her hair and changed her name, saw an opportunity. Her reputation, carefully cultivated by the press and her powerful lovers, was now one of unreliability, of mental instability. They decided to use it against her. The vehicle for their betrayal was a film ironically titled, Something's Gotta Give. The production was troubled from the start. Marilyn, sick with chronic sinusitis and emotionally shattered by the Kennedy affair, was frequently late or absent from the set. The studio, which had tolerated far worse from male stars for decades, began building a public case against her. They painted her as a spoiled, unprofessional diva. They ignored the doctor's notes confirming her illness. It was a calculated campaign of public humiliation, designed to break her contract and her spirit. The creators were turning on their creation, preparing to tear her down from the pedestal they had built. Marilyn, however, was a fighter. She sensed the studio's intentions and planned a preemptive strike. In a bold act of defiance, she arranged a now legendary photo shoot with photographer Lawrence Schiller for a scene in which she was to swim nude in a pool. The studio had planned to have her wear a flesh-colored body stocking. Marilyn decided otherwise. "This'll show them," she reportedly said, shedding her robe and diving into the water. The resulting photos were a global sensation. They landed on the covers of magazines worldwide, including the prestigious Life. It was a brilliant power play. She was reminding Fox, and the world, that time was Marilyn Monroe. She was their greatest asset, and she was still in control of her image. But the architects at Fox were unmoved. Her trip to New York to sing for President Kennedy was the final excuse they needed. On June 8, 1962, on her 36th birthday, 20th Century Fox officially fired the biggest movie star in the world. It was a devastating, public shaming. They sued her for breach of contract for $750,000. They immediately announced her replacement in the film, an actress named Lee Remick. They intended to erase her, to prove that even Marilyn Monroe was disposable. But they had miscalculated the power of their own creation. The film's leading man, Dean Martin, refused to work with anyone but Marilyn. The insurance companies balked. The studio was in chaos. Marilyn, from her exile, launched a masterful publicity counteroffensive. She gave a series of candid, heartbreaking interviews, posing for legendary photo shoots that portrayed her as a vulnerable, wronged artist. She was winning the public relations war. The studio, hemorrhaging money, was forced to crawl back. They rehired her, giving her a new, unprecedented two-picture deal worth $1 million, along with complete creative control. It was the greatest victory of her professional life. She had faced down the architects of the studio system and won. She had proven she was more powerful than the men who had invented her, but it was a hollow victory. She had defeated the studio, but the other architects were still circling. The Kennedys were a silent, terrifying threat in the background. Her own psyche, battered by decades of manipulation, was fragile. She had won the battle, but she was about to lose the war. The final act was beginning, and all the ghosts she had been running from were about to converge in a single, tragic weekend. ACT-7, The Unraveling of the Masterpiece, the summer of 1962. On the surface, it was a time of triumph for Marilyn. She had her new contract, she was planning new projects, she had proven her power, but beneath the surface, a perfect storm was gathering. The architects were closing in, each demanding their final payment. The Kennedy connection had become a ticking time bomb. With elections approaching, her knowledge of their world was no longer just a liability. It was a clear and present danger. The web of surveillance tightened. Her home in Brentwood, the first she had ever owned, began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a prison. Friends reported that she was convinced her house was bugged. In this state of extreme paranoia and isolation, another powerful male figure entered her life. Her psychiatrist, Ralph Greenson. He had become more than her doctor. He was her gatekeeper, her confidant, another architect trying to manage the beautiful, broken creation. His unorthodox methods, including daily, hours-long therapy sessions and controlling her social interactions, blurred the line between treatment and obsession. She was now completely surrounded. The studio that had just rehired her was pressuring her to return to work. The specter of the Kennedys loomed, a silent, powerful force demanding her silence. And her own mind, the battleground where Norma Jeane and Marilyn had fought for decades, was on the brink of collapse. The final 48 hours of her life are a vortex of conflicting reports and chilling mysteries. There were frantic phone calls, alleged visits from powerful men, a desperate attempt to connect with a world that was systematically shutting her out. On Saturday, August 4th, the threads began to unravel completely. There were sightings of Robert Kennedy in Los Angeles. Peter Lawford, the Kennedy brother-in-law and Marilyn's friend, spoke of a final, slurred, terrifying phone call from her. "Say goodbye to Pat," she allegedly said. "Say goodbye to the president, and say goodbye to yourself, because you're a nice guy." Then, silence. Late that night, she was found dead. The official cause was acute barbiturate poisoning, ruled a probable suicide. But the architects had left their fingerprints all over the scene. The little red diary was missing. Phone records vanished. The timeline of the night's events, as told by her housekeeper and Dr. Greenson, was full of contradictions and strange delays. The mystery of her death is not the point. The point is its horrifying inevitability. Whether by her own hand or another's, her death was the final, logical step in the process they had all started. They had built a goddess of light and sex and laughter, but the human foundation required to support such a weight had been systematically chipped away. Ben Leon gave her a name, but took her identity. Johnny Hyde gave her a career, but demanded her life. Joe DiMaggio gave her his love, but required her submission. Arthur Miller offered his mind, but dissected her soul. The Kennedys offered her power, but commanded her silence. In the end, the masterpiece was too beautiful, too powerful, too human. The architects, one by one, had built a gilded cage around a fragile soul. When she finally learned how to rattle the bars, they could not tolerate the noise. They had engineered the most desired woman in the world, and when they were finished, they left her to die alone in the dark, with nothing but their creation, the immortal, impossible goddess, for company. The image they built is eternal, forever smiling from our screens, a ghost of perfection. But the woman they broke haunts us with a single, unanswered question: Was it worth it? The story of Marilyn Monroe is a labyrinth of secrets. If you wish to continue exploring the shadows of her world, subscribe to Boulevard of Monroe. The darkness has more stories to tell.